The old mansion on Thistlewood Hill had always loomed like a secret over the small town of Larkspur. Everyone had their theories about its owner, the reclusive Miss Evangeline Carter, a woman said to have inherited the house from a family whose roots ran deeper than anyone could remember. Despite its grandeur, the mansion exuded an air of abandonment. Most windows were veiled by curtains thick with dust, and the gardens were a tangle of wild ivy and creeping shadows. When my father took the job as its caretaker, we didn't realize it would consume our lives, or how much the house would change us. I was 16, full of boredom and rebellion, when we first arrived. "You're going to love it," my father had said, his enthusiasm forced. I didn't believe him. The place was enormous, sure, but the longer I stared at it, the heavier my chest felt. Something about the house didn't sit right. It was as if the building was watching us, its dark windows like unblinking eyes. The first few days were uneventful. My father worked tirelessly in the garden, clearing brambles and repairing the sagging greenhouse. Inside, my mother took inventory of the dusty antiques that cluttered the house. I wandered the halls aimlessly, hoping to find a signal on my phone or at least something interesting enough to take my mind off how isolated we were. It was on one of those aimless strolls that I discovered the door. It was tucked away in the east wing, behind a tapestry of hunting dogs and stags. The tapestry had fallen askew, revealing the faint outline of a wooden frame in the wall. My fingers found the latch almost instinctively, and before I could think twice, the door creaked open. Behind it was a staircase spiraling down into darkness. The air that seeped up from below was cold and carried the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic, blood. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. A smarter person might have turned around, but curiosity pulled me forward. The steps groaned under my weight as I descended, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. At the bottom, the space opened into a room lined with stone walls and a dirt floor. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it, an object that seemed to hum with its own energy. It was a mirror, though unlike any I'd ever seen. Its frame was ornate, carved with figures that writhed as if alive. The glass shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not just the room but something else, something wrong. Shadows that didn't belong to me moved within its depths. I reached out, compelled to touch it, but a voice cut through the silence. "Don't." I spun around, my heart hammering. My father stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face pale and drawn. His eyes locked on the mirror with an intensity I'd never seen before. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "You shouldn't have come down here. Some doors are meant to stay closed." Over the next few days, I noticed a change in my father. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He spent hours staring out the window of his study, his gaze fixed on the gardens below. When I asked him about the mirror, he brushed me off, insisting it was just an old trinket left by the previous owners. But I couldn't let it go. The image of the shadows twisting in the glass haunted my dreams, drawing me back to the east wing again and again. Each time, I found the door locked, as if my father had taken precautions to keep me away. One night, unable to sleep, I crept down the hall with a flashlight. The house groaned around me, its wooden frame shifting in the night air. When I reached the tapestry, I found the door ajar. The air in the stairwell felt colder than before, and my flashlight flickered as I descended. The mirror was still there, its surface gleaming like liquid silver in the dim light. This time, I didn't hesitate. I reached out and touched the glass. The world around me dissolved. The first thing I felt was the cold. Not the kind of cold you get from a brisk winter morning, but a bone-deep chill that gnawed at my very being. My breath caught in my throat as the world around me swirled into an abyss of black and gray. Then the whispers started. Faint at first, like a breeze rustling through dry leaves, but they grew louder and more distinct. Voices, countless and overlapping, spoke in a language I couldn't understand. Yet somehow, I felt their meaning. "Who are you? Why are you here? What do you seek? The darkness began to take shape. I was no longer in the stone-walled room beneath the mansion. Instead, I stood in a vast, desolate plain under a sky devoid of stars. The ground was cracked and dry, its surface littered with fragments of shattered mirrors. Each shard reflected a distorted version of myself, some smiling, others weeping, and a few glaring at me with pure malice. I stumbled forward, disoriented, when a figure emerged from the void. It was tall and cloaked, its face obscured by a hood. The air around it seemed to ripple, as though it were made of heat waves and shadows. "Why have you come?" it asked, its voice reverberating through the air like a low growl. I don't know," I stammered. "I didn't mean to. I just touched the mirror." The figure tilted its head, as if scrutinizing me. "The mirror does not call to the unworthy. You are here for a reason, whether you know it or not." Before I could respond, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and the figure raised an arm. A surge of wind knocked me off my feet, and I fell backward into one of the mirror shards. The glass didn't cut me, instead, it swallowed me whole. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the stone room. The mirror stood before me, its surface now dark and lifeless. My head throbbed, and my hands trembled as I pushed myself to my feet. What had just happened? Was it a dream? A hallucination? Footsteps echoed on the stairs, and my father appeared again. His face was a mask of anger and fear. "What did you do?" he demanded, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the mirror. I didn't mean to," I stuttered. You touched it, didn't you?" His grip tightened, and his voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I shook my head, too stunned to reply. He dragged me up the stairs and slammed the hidden door shut behind us. For a moment, he just stood there, his shoulders heaving as if he were trying to catch his breath. "You're never to go near that room again," he finally said, his voice low and trembling. "Promise me." "I promise," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I meant it. The days that followed were a blur of tension and unease. My father barely spoke to me, and my mother seemed oblivious to the growing rift between us. But the house itself felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. At night, I could hear faint whispers coming from the walls, too soft to make out but persistent enough to keep me awake. One evening, as I sat in my room trying to read, I heard a faint tapping at my window. I looked up, expecting to see a branch swaying in the wind, but instead, I saw a face. Pale and hollow-eyed, it stared at me through the glass, its mouth moving as if trying to speak. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure raised a skeletal hand and pointed toward the east wing. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I knew I should have ignored it. I should have stayed in my room and locked the door. But something compelled me to follow. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept down the hall toward the forbidden door. The tapestry was gone, and the door stood wide open. The room at the bottom of the stairs was colder than ever, and the mirror glowed faintly in the darkness. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward and placed my hand on the glass. The transition was faster this time. The desolate plain greeted me once more, but the shards of mirror on the ground had multiplied. The reflections they showed were more vivid, more alive. One of them caught my attention, a version of me, older and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. The cloaked figure appeared again, this time closer. "You have returned," it said, its tone almost amused. "I don't understand what's happening," I said, my voice trembling. "What is this place?" "This is the Between," it replied. "A realm of echoes and shadows, where the boundaries between worlds blur. Why am I here?" "You seek answers," it said simply. "But beware, answers often come at a price." Before I could ask what it meant, the figure reached out and touched my forehead with a long, claw-like finger. A searing pain shot through my skull, and images flooded my mind, visions of the mansion's past, of people who had come before me, each drawn to the mirror and each meeting a terrible fate. When the pain subsided, I found myself back in the stone room, gasping for breath. The mirror's glow had faded, but its presence still loomed, oppressive and menacing. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The mansion, already eerie, now seemed alive, its walls whispered in voices too faint to understand, and shadows moved in corners where there shouldn't have been any. The worst part was the mirror. Even though I had sworn to avoid the east wing, I felt its pull constantly, like a hook buried deep in my chest. And the dreams, they were the worst. Every night, I found myself back in the between, wandering the desolate plain of shattered mirrors. The hooded figure was always there, its presence oppressive and unrelenting. It didn't speak again, but its silence was worse than its words. It was as if it were waiting for something. One night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I heard the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The noise was coming from downstairs. Against every ounce of reason, I slipped out of bed and crept toward the source. The noise led me to my father's study. The door was ajar, and dim light spilled into the hallway. I peered inside and froze. My father was there, kneeling on the floor. He had pushed his desk aside to reveal a trapdoor I had never seen before. It was open, and he was lowering a bundle wrapped in a thick black cloth into the darkness below. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were performing some kind of ritual. "Dad?" My voice came out as a whisper, but it was enough to make him freeze. He turned slowly, his face pale and strained. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping into the room. "It's not safe," he said, standing and moving toward me. "You don't understand." "What don't I understand?" I snapped. "What's going on with this house? With that mirror? What aren't you telling me?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the trapdoor. "It's a burden," he said finally. "A legacy passed down through generations. The mirror, it's a gateway, a prison, and a curse. It shows you what you most fear, what you most desire, and then it takes. It always takes. Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded. "Because knowing won't save you," he said, his voice breaking. "Once you've seen it, once it's seen you, it's too late." The next morning, my father was gone. His truck was still in the driveway, and his tools were untouched, but he was nowhere to be found. My mother was frantic, pacing the house and calling his name, but I knew he wouldn't answer. I spent the day searching the grounds, combing through the overgrown gardens and the shadowed corners of the mansion, but there was no trace of him. By nightfall, I was exhausted and no closer to understanding what had happened. And then, as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out the window, I saw it, a faint light glowing in the east wing. The mirror. I didn't even bother with a flashlight this time. The house seemed to guide me, the hull stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. By the time I reached the stone room, I wasn't even surprised to find the mirror waiting for me, its surface shimmering like liquid silver. I approached slowly, my reflection warping and twisting as I drew near. The glass seemed to ripple, and for a moment, I saw my father's face staring back at me, his eyes wide with terror. Then the image shifted, and I saw myself, older, broken, and hollow. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. The glass shuddered, and the hooded figure appeared in its depths. "You have come," it said, its voice low and resonant. "You have seen the truth." "What truth?" I demanded. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The figure raised a hand, and the room around me dissolved into the desolate plain once more. The air was heavy, and the shards of mirror beneath my feet crunched with every step. The figure loomed before me, its presence oppressive and unyielding. "This is the between," it said. "A place of echoes and shadows, where the boundaries of reality blur. The mirror is a door, a bridge between worlds. But it demands a price. What price? I asked, my voice trembling. It takes what you hold most dear, the figure said. Your father knew this. He thought he could bargain, but the mirror does not bargain. My blood turned cold. What did it take from him? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the horizon, where a massive structure loomed, a tower of jagged glass and twisted metal that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. If you wish to save him, you must enter the tower, the figure said. But beware, the mirror always takes. The tower was a nightmare made real. Its walls seemed to shift and writhe, and the air inside was thick with an acrid, metallic tang. As I ascended its spiraling stairs, I passed countless rooms, each one a reflection of my worst fears and regrets. In one room, I saw my father, his face pale and his eyes empty, sitting at the dining table as if nothing had happened. In another, I saw myself, older and broken, staring at the mirror with tears streaming down my face. At the top of the tower, I found the mirror again, but this time, it was cracked and dark. My father stood before it, his hands pressed against the glass. Dad! I called out, rushing toward him. He turned to me, his face twisted with pain. You shouldn't have come, he said. It's too late. Before I could respond, the mirror began to glow, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The last thing I heard was my father's voice, calling my name, before everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the stone room beneath the mansion. The mirror was gone, and the room was silent. My father was nowhere to be seen. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier. My mother eventually gave up searching and decided we should leave. I didn't argue. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again. And when I close my eyes, I see the between waiting for me, its endless plain of shattered mirrors calling me back. Leaving the mansion didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. My mother and I moved to a small apartment in the nearby town, far from the looming presence of Thistlewood Hill, but its shadows seemed to follow me. The whispers persisted. They didn't come from the walls anymore but from the edges of my mind, a constant hum that grew louder when I was alone. At night, I dreamed of the between and the towering structure of glass and metal, its jagged spires piercing a blood-red sky. No matter how hard I tried to push the memories away, they clung to me like cobwebs. My mother coped by throwing herself into work, taking extra shifts at the diner to keep us afloat. She never spoke about my father or the mansion, as if pretending it didn't exist would erase the pain. I envied her ability to compartmentalize. For me, the mansion, and the mirror, had become an obsession. I spent hours researching its history, scouring local libraries and archives for any mention of Thistlewood Hill or the Carter family. What I found only deepened the mystery. The mansion had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist named Elias Carter. His family was known for their eccentricities and their tendency to keep to themselves. Over the years, rumors swirled about the Carters dabbling in the occult. Several members of the family had vanished without explanation, and those who remained were plagued by tragedy. Evangeline Carter, the last known heir, had lived in the mansion alone for decades before disappearing herself. No one knew what had become of her, and the house had been abandoned ever since, until my father took the caretaker job. But what struck me most was the recurring mention of a looking glass in the Carter family's journals and records. Descriptions of it varied, but the details always hinted at something sinister, an artifact that reveals the soul, opens doors, and demands sacrifice. I became convinced that the mirror was the key to everything. If I could understand it, I could find my father, and maybe put an end to the whispers. The breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon when I stumbled upon a local legend in an old book of folklore. It told the story of a shadow glass that allowed its owner to glimpse other realms. The glass, the book claimed, was cursed, trapping those who gazed too long into its depths. One passage stood out: to break the curse, one must face their reflection and offer what they fear to lose. The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't fully understand what they meant, but I knew one thing: I had to go back to the mansion. Returning to Thistlewood Hill felt like stepping into a graveyard. The house loomed against the gray sky, its windows dark and empty. The overgrown garden was silent, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. I made my way to the east wing, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. When I reached the stone room, I hesitated, half expecting the mirror to be there, waiting for me. But the room was empty. The pedestal where the mirror had stood was bare, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe the mirror was gone, and I could finally move on. Then I heard the whispers. They were louder now, coming from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. They spoke in a cacophony of voices, overlapping and echoing until I could barely think. But one word stood out, clear and distinct. Tower. The tower from my dreams. The between. I didn't know how I would get there, but I knew I had to try. The whispers didn't stop as I left the mansion and made my way back to the town. They followed me, growing louder with every step. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. If the mirror was a door, then I needed to find it, or create one. I spent hours staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, willing it to change, to show me the between. But the glass remained stubbornly ordinary. Frustrated, I smashed the mirror with my fist, the shards scattering across the sink. Blood dripped from my knuckles, but I barely noticed. Among the broken pieces, one shard caught my eye. It shimmered faintly, its surface rippling like liquid silver. I picked it up, my heart pounding. As I held it, the whispers grew louder, and the world around me began to blur. The shard seemed to pull me in, and before I could resist, I was falling into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the between. The desolate plain stretched out before me, the ground littered with shards of broken mirrors. The sky was a swirling mass of gray and black, and the air was heavy with the same metallic tang I remembered. The tower loomed in the distance, its spires glinting in the dim light. I knew I had to reach it, but the path was treacherous. The shards beneath my feet cut into my skin, and the whispers surrounded me, growing louder with every step. As I approached the tower, the hooded figure appeared again, blocking my path. "You return," it said, its voice low and resonant. "But the tower is not for the faint of heart. Are you prepared to face what lies within?" "I have to," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to find my father." The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. "Very well. But remember, what you seek may not be what you find." With that, it stepped aside, and the massive doors of the tower swung open. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating. The walls seemed alive, shifting and writhing as if they were made of shadows. The stairs spiraled upward, disappearing into darkness. I climbed, each step heavier than the last. The whispers were deafening now, and the air was filled with a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. At the top of the tower, I found a room filled with mirrors. They covered every surface, reflecting me from every angle. But these weren't ordinary reflections. They showed me moments from my life, some I remembered, others I didn't. They showed my fears, my regrets, my failures. In the center of the room stood the mirror. It was cracked and dark, just as I had seen in my dreams. My father was there, standing before it, his face pale and drawn. "Dad," I called out, rushing toward him. He turned to me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "It's too late for me." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "We can leave together. We can." The mirror began to glow, its surface rippling like water. The whispers grew louder, and the room shook violently. Before I could react, the glass shattered, and everything went dark. I woke in complete darkness. For a moment, I thought I was back in the tower, but the air here was different, stagnant and heavy, pressing against my chest. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my ears ring. I stood slowly, my hands groping in the dark for something, anything, to orient myself. My fingers brushed against a cold, rough surface, and I realized I was in some kind of tunnel. The walls were damp, and the faint metallic tang of blood lingered in the air. I took a cautious step forward, then another. The ground beneath me was uneven, littered with shards of glass that crunched underfoot. As I moved deeper into the tunnel, a faint light appeared ahead, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing a cavernous chamber. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces cracked and fogged. In the center of the room stood a figure, my father. "Dad!" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. He turned to face me, but his expression was wrong. His eyes were wide and unseeing, and his mouth hung open as if frozen in a silent scream. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his movements were stiff and unnatural. "Dad?" I took a cautious step forward. "It's me." "It's..." He lunged. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the ground as he barreled past me. He moved with an unnatural speed, his limbs jerking and twisting as if pulled by invisible strings. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad, stop!" I shouted, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He came at me again, his hands clawing at the air. I dodged, backing away toward the edge of the room. "Please, it's me!" I cried, but it was no use. This wasn't my father, not anymore. The walls of the cavern seemed to shift and close in, the mirrors reflecting the scene from every angle. I caught glimpses of myself, my father, and something else. A shadow, larger than life, loomed behind the reflections, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. "Stop running," a voice echoed from the shadows, low and guttural. "You can't save him." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The shadow laughed, a deep, hollow sound that seemed to vibrate through the room. "I am the keeper of this place. The mirror is mine, and so is he." "No!" I shouted. "You can't have him. I'll take him back." "You cannot take what has already been claimed," the voice hissed. "But you may take his place." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the shadow, my mind racing. Take his place? Was that what the mirror wanted all along? "What happens if I stay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't answer immediately. Instead, it shifted closer, the darkness coiling like a living thing. "You will become part of the between. A guardian. A reflection. And he'll be free." "Yes," the shadow said, its voice like ice. "But freedom comes at a cost." My father's lifeless eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. He stopped moving, his body trembling as if struggling against an unseen force. "Please," he rasped, his voice weak and broken. "Don't do this." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Dad, I can't leave you here." "You have to," he said. "This place, it changes you. It's already taken too much from me." Tears blurred my vision as I shook my head. "I can't. I won't." The shadow loomed over us, its presence suffocating. "Make your choice," it commanded. I stepped forward, my legs shaking. "I'll stay," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "No," my father shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "You don't understand." "I do," I said, cutting him off. "I can't lose you, Dad. I won't." The shadow seemed to smile, its form rippling with satisfaction. "So be it." Before I could react, tendrils of darkness shot out, wrapping around my arms and legs. The cold was unbearable, like ice seeping into my very bones. My father cried out, struggling to reach me, but the shadow held him back. As the darkness pulled me into the mirror, I locked eyes with my father one last time. "Go," I whispered. "Be free." The last thing I saw was his face, streaked with tears, before the world dissolved into black. I don't know how much time passed before I opened my eyes again. The between was silent, the desolate plain stretching out before me. I was alone, the hooded figure nowhere in sight. I felt different, heavier, as if the weight of the between had settled into my very soul. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from within. I turned slowly, taking in my surroundings. The tower was gone, replaced by a single mirror that stood in the center of the plain. Its surface was smooth and dark, reflecting nothing but the emptiness around it. As I approached, I saw my own reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't me, not entirely. My eyes were hollow, my skin pale. I raised a hand, and the reflection mimicked my movement, but there was something off, something wrong. "You are the keeper now," a voice whispered, low and resonant. "Guard the mirror. Protect the between." I reached out to touch the glass, and as my fingers brushed its surface, a flood of images filled my mind. People, strangers, wandering into the between, drawn by the mirror's call. I saw their fears, their desires, their struggles. And I saw myself, standing in the shadows, watching them. The mirror was mine now. Back in the real world, the mansion stood silent and empty. My father left it behind, his memories of the between fading like a dream. He never spoke of it again, and neither did my mother. They moved on, rebuilding their lives piece by piece. But I remained, my reflection etched into the mirror's surface. The between was my prison, my domain, my purpose. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the world sleeps, I feel the pull of the mirror. I watch as it calls to another, drawing them into the shadows. I watch as they step into the between, unaware of what awaits. I am the keeper now. And the mirror always takes.